People think freedom means doing whatever you want. I thought it meant walking barefoot through Thailand for 7 years. I was wrong. Freedom isn't about rejecting everything, it's about knowing when to stop rejecting yourself. I learned that lesson the hard way, one cut foot at a time, one strange stare at a time, one friendship lost at a time. They called me the crazy Farang, who wouldn't wear shoes. I called myself enlightened. Truth is, I was just a broken man who confused stubbornness with spirituality. 7 years of bare feet taught me more about pride than any temple ever could. Sometimes the thing you think makes you free is actually the thing that keeps you trapped. If our stories resonate with you, don't forget to like, comment, and tell us where you're watching from. This story was shared with us by one of our longtime viewers. He asked us not to share his name, but he wanted his experience heard. I was 52 when I arrived in Chiang Mai, with nothing but a backpack and a divorce decree. My marriage had crumbled after 24 years. My kids barely spoke to me, and I'd lost half of everything I'd worked for. I felt hollow, like someone had scooped out my insides and left me walking around empty. I need to find myself. I told my brother before I left Phoenix. He rolled his eyes. You need therapy, not Thailand. But I was convinced that geography could fix what felt broken inside me. I'd read about Buddhist monks who walked barefoot, connecting with the earth, feeling every step as a meditation. It sounded profound. It sounded like exactly what a lost man like me needed. My first week in Thailand, I was still wearing my old running shoes, sweating through the humid streets, feeling like every other tourist. But then I visited Wat Phra, that Doi Suthep, and something shifted. I watched the monks walking silently, their bare feet moving across the temple stones with such grace, such presence. They're truly connected, I thought. They understand something I don't. That night, back in my small apartment near the old city, I pulled off my shoes and socks and walked out onto my balcony. The cool tiles felt electric against my skin. This is it, I whispered to myself. This is how I find my way back to who I really am. The next morning, I walked to the morning market barefoot. My feet were already tender from the rough concrete, but I told myself this was part of the process. Pain was just attachment leaving the body, right? The vendors stared at me with confused expressions. One elderly woman pointed at my feet and said something in Thai that I couldn't understand, but her tone was concerned. I smiled and nodded, assuming she was curious about my spiritual practice. I'm connecting with the earth, I said in broken Thai, gesturing to my bare feet. She looked worried and walked away. I interpreted her concern as ignorance. She doesn't understand what I'm doing, I thought. Most people are too trapped in material concerns to see the beauty of this path. For weeks, I felt invincible. Every step on hot pavement, every pebble that dug into my skin, every strange look from locals, it all felt like evidence that I was doing something important, something transformative. I started keeping a journal of what I called my enlightened moments, like when I walked through the rain and felt completely present with each drop, or when I meditated in the park and a dog came up to sniff my bare feet, and I felt this deep connection to all living things. I was becoming someone new, someone better. I wasn't just another failed American running away from his problems. I was a seeker, a spiritual warrior, someone brave enough to live authentically. But the stares kept coming. At restaurants, servers would glance nervously at my feet and whisper to each other. In shops, owners would point to signs I couldn't read, gesturing at my feet with uncomfortable expressions. I started carrying a small notebook where I'd write down these resistance encounters, telling myself that every negative reaction was just proof that I was challenging the status quo, forcing people to question their own attachments to material things like shoes. They're threatened by my freedom, I wrote one evening. My bare feet remind them of everything they've given up in exchange for social acceptance. I felt superior, enlightened, chosen. The isolation was gradual. I tried to join conversations with other expats at coffee shops, but somehow the topic always turned to my feet. Aren't you worried about diseases? One British woman asked. What about glass or nails? I'd launch into explanations about natural immunity, about how the body adapts, about ancient wisdom and modern fears. Their eyes would glaze over. He's one of those, I could see them thinking. Slowly, invitations stopped coming. People would see me approaching and suddenly remember urgent appointments. I told myself they were jealous of my spiritual courage. Then I met Arpa at a small cafe near Tha Phai Gate. She was maybe 34, with kind eyes and perfect English learned from years working with tourists. When she saw my bare feet, she didn't look away or whisper to co-workers. She just asked, "Does that hurt?" Her directness caught me off guard. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but pain is just sensation. When you don't resist it, it becomes something else." She tilted her head, genuinely curious. "What does it become?" I felt a rush of excitement. Finally, someone who wanted to understand. "Freedom," I said, settling into my explanation. "In America, we're so disconnected from nature, from our bodies, from what's real. Shoes are just another barrier between us and authentic experience." Arpa listened politely, occasionally asking questions. "But don't your feet get dirty? How do you walk when it's very hot? What do people at temples say?" I interpreted her questions as fascination, proof that my journey was inspiring others. I talked for nearly an hour about consciousness and connection, about rejecting Western materialism, about finding truth through simplicity. She nodded and smiled, and I left feeling validated, understood. We started meeting regularly. Arpa would ask about my life in America, my divorce, my children. I'd steer the conversation back to my spiritual insights, my daily discoveries about presence and awareness. "Today I meditated for 2 hours in the park," I'd tell her. I could feel the earth's energy flowing through my feet into my entire body. She'd listen quietly, sometimes looking concerned. "Are you happy? Are you, Cass? Two, 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 two?" she asked one afternoon. The question surprised me. "I'm becoming enlightened," I said. "Happiness is just another attachment." She frowned slightly but didn't argue. The monsoon season hit hard that year. The streets flooded regularly, turning into rivers of brown water mixed with garbage, motor oil, and things I didn't want to think about. But I kept walking barefoot, telling myself this was the ultimate test of my commitment. If I can't maintain my practice during challenging times, then it's not real practice, I reasoned. After one particularly heavy flood, I walked through ankle-deep water from my apartment to meet Arpa at our usual cafe. My feet felt different afterward. Hot, throbbing, tender, in new ways. Within 2 days, my left foot had swollen to twice its normal size. The skin was red and hot to the touch, with angry streaks running up my ankle. When I pressed on it, pus oozed from several small cuts. Arpa took one look and said, "You need to see a doctor right now." I shook my head. My body knows how to heal itself. Western medicine just treats symptoms, not causes. She stared at me with an expression I couldn't read. "This is not about Western or Eastern. This is about infection. This is dangerous." But I was convinced that seeking medical help would be admitting defeat, betraying my spiritual path. I meditated longer, visualized healing light flowing through my foot, repeated mantras about perfect health. The infection worsened. My foot began to smell, a sweet, rotten odor that followed me everywhere. Arpa's visits became tense, focused entirely on my refusal to get treatment. "You think this makes you spiritual?" she asked during one heated conversation. "You think Buddha wanted people to suffer from preventable infections?" I accused her of having no faith in natural healing, of being brainwashed by modern fears. "You don't understand," I said. "This is part of my journey." At Wat Chedi Luang, my favorite temple for morning meditation, something humiliating happened. I was walking toward the main hall when a young monk approached me quietly. He spoke in gentle English. "Excuse me, sir. I'm sorry, but we must ask you to leave." My face burned with embarrassment. "Why?" I demanded. "I come here every day. I'm more devoted than most of these tourists." The monk looked uncomfortable, but firm. "Your feet, they are not clean. It is not appropriate for temple. Please understand." Other visitors were staring now, some taking photos. I felt exposed, humiliated. "This is exactly what Buddha preached against," I said, my voice getting louder. "Attachment to appearances, to rules that have nothing to do with true spirituality." The monk remained calm. "Respect is also part of practice, sir. Cleanliness shows respect for sacred space, for other people who come to pray." Arpa, who had come with me that morning, looked mortified. She apologized to the monk in rapid Thai, then took my arm. "Please," she whispered, "let's go." But I was too angry, too humiliated. I continued arguing about institutional Buddhism versus true Dharma, about how Jesus walked among lepers, about spiritual courage versus social conformity. Security was called. We left in silence. The next week, Arpa brought her aunt to my apartment without warning. Her aunt was a nurse at the local hospital, a small, fierce woman who took one look at my foot and began speaking rapidly in Thai. Arpa translated, "She says you could lose your foot. She says the infection is very serious, maybe in your blood now." I felt cornered, attacked. "Tell her I don't need Western medicine," I said. "Tell her I'm handling this naturally." The aunt examined my foot more closely, then spoke again, her voice urgent. "She says you could die," Arpa said quietly. "She says this is not about medicine or culture. This is about life." I exploded. 7 months of isolation, of people not understanding, of feeling like an outsider, all came pouring out. "You're trying to destroy everything I've worked for," I shouted at Arpa. "You want me to give up my practice, to become just another tourist buying things and following rules. This is exactly what they did to Buddha people who couldn't understand his truth, trying to force him back into conventional life." Arpa's eyes filled with tears. "This is not about your practice," she said. "This is about you being so proud that you would rather die than admit you made a mistake." Then she said something that cut through all my spiritual rhetoric. "In Thailand, we believe respect is part of spirituality. Clean body, clean mind, clean spirit. You think being dirty makes you holy? You think making other people uncomfortable is enlightenment? Real Buddhist practice is about reducing suffering, not creating it. Your feet hurt you. They hurt people who must smell them. They hurt people who worry about you. Where is the wisdom in that?" Her aunt packed up her medical supplies and left, shaking her head. Arpa followed without another word. I tried to find validation among Chiang Mai's expat community, the aging hippies and spiritual seekers who gathered at certain bars and coffee shops. Surely they would understand my commitment to authentic living, but even they had limits. "Maybe tone it down a bit, mate," suggested an Australian who'd been in Thailand for 15 years. "You can be spiritual without the whole bare feet thing." A German woman who practiced Buddhism told me gently, "Extreme anything is still extreme. The middle path, remember?" I realized I'd become known as the crazy barefoot American, someone to be tolerated but not taken seriously. Former friends started avoiding me entirely. I'd walk into restaurants and see people suddenly remember urgent phone calls. Party invitations stopped coming. When I did show up places, I could smell myself, that sweet, rotten infection smell mixed with street grime and sweat. People would move away, open windows, cut conversations short. "They're threatened by authenticity," I wrote in my journal. "They've sold out, and my presence reminds them of their compromise." But deep down, something was starting to crack. Was I enlightened? Or just isolated? Was this spiritual growth, or was I becoming the kind of person I used to cross the street to avoid? By year 3, my foot infection had returned worse than ever. I could barely walk without extreme pain, but I still refused treatment. The smell was so bad that even I couldn't ignore it. My landlord started leaving passive-aggressive notes about hygiene. Arpa had stopped visiting entirely after I'd accused her of betraying our friendship by siding with conventional society against my spiritual journey. I was completely alone, exactly the opposite of what I'd been seeking when I started this path. One morning, desperate for basic medications, I tried to drag myself to the local pharmacy. I couldn't put weight on my infected foot, so I was essentially crawling, using walls and door frames to support myself. The smell followed me like a cloud. When I finally reached the pharmacy, the pharmacist took one look at me and stepped backward. He said something in Thai, shaking his head, pointing at the door. Other customers stared in horror and disgust. A child asked his mother loudly, "What's wrong with that man?" I tried to explain that I just needed basic supplies, but the pharmacist was firm. He wanted me out of his store, crawling back home through the streets of Chiang Mai, smelling like death, avoided by everyone. I had a moment of terrible clarity. This wasn't enlightenment. This wasn't spiritual courage. This was just a 55-year-old man so broken by divorce and failure that he'd rather nearly die than admit he'd made a mistake. I wasn't brave or wise or connected to anything divine. I was just stubborn, proud, and completely alone. Everything I'd told myself about spiritual practice was just elaborate justification for my refusal to rejoin the world that had hurt me. I don't remember much about the next few days. My landlord found me semi-conscious in my apartment, burning with fever, my foot grotesquely swollen and leaking pus. He called an ambulance, probably saving my life. At the hospital, the doctor explained through a translator that I was hours away from sepsis, possibly death. They would need to perform emergency surgery to save my foot. The doctor said in careful English, "Few more days, and we would have to amputate. Maybe you would have died." I was too weak to argue about Western medicine versus natural healing. The anesthesia felt like mercy. During my week-long hospital stay, something shifted inside me. The nurses, despite my smell and the disgusting state of my foot, treated me with professional kindness. They cleaned my wounds, changed my dressings, brought me food and water, never once making me feel ashamed or judged. A young nurse named Ploy would sit with me during her breaks, practicing her English while I recovered. "You are feeling better today?" she'd ask with genuine concern. "Your foot is healing good." Her simple kindness cracked something open in my chest that had been frozen for years. These people, doing their practical work with compassion, seemed more genuinely spiritual than I'd been in 3 years of elaborate self-deception. Real enlightenment, I began to think, might be simpler than I'd imagined. Maybe it was just about reducing suffering mine and others, instead of creating elaborate philosophical justifications for poor choices. Maybe wisdom wasn't about rejecting the world but learning how to live in it with grace and consideration for others. On my 4th day in the hospital, Arpa appeared at my bedside carrying flowers and a container of homemade soup. I started crying when I saw her, not spiritual tears of awakening, just the messy, grateful tears of a man who'd forgotten what kindness felt like. "I'm sorry," I said. "I'm so sorry for everything." She sat quietly while I ate her soup, not lecturing or saying, "I told you so," just being present in that way that felt more healing than any meditation I'd ever attempted. After a while, she started talking about Thai concepts of Krengjai consideration for others and Sanuk finding joy in simple, clean pleasures. "Spirituality in Thailand is not about rejecting the world," she said softly. "It's about finding your place in it with respect and happiness. We don't try to prove we're special. We try to make life better for everyone around us." I listened, really listened, for the first time in years. Her words weren't coming from books or spiritual teachers. They were coming from a lifetime of living in community, of understanding that individual enlightenment meant nothing if it caused suffering to others. She explained that cleanliness and proper dress weren't Western impositions but ancient Buddhist practices about respect for yourself, for others, for sacred spaces. When you come to temple dirty, you're saying your personal ideas are more important than community feelings. That's not humility. That's pride disguised as spirituality. I felt the truth of this sink into my bones. I'd been so focused on rejecting what I saw as Western materialism that I'd completely missed the point of Eastern philosophy: interconnectedness, compassion, respect for all beings. But I thought I was being authentic, I said weakly. I thought I was rejecting superficial social rules. Arpa smiled sadly. Authentic means being true to your real self, not your angry self or your broken self. Your real self wants to connect with people, to be kind, to fit in without losing who you are. That's harder than being rebel, but it's more honest. She forgave me. But she was clear: if we're going to be friends, you have to change. Not just feet, your whole way of thinking about other people. I nodded, finally understanding that my 7-year journey had taught me nothing about enlightenment, but everything about the difference between spiritual practice and spiritual ego. I'd been using Buddhism as a weapon against the world that had hurt me, when what I needed was to use it as a bridge back to human connection. The monks I'd watched at Doi Suthep weren't walking barefoot to prove their superiority. They were practicing humility, service, and respect for their community. Leaving the hospital felt like emerging from a cave I'd been trapped in for years. My first stop was a shoe store. The elderly Thai man who owned it looked puzzled when I explained, in broken Thai, that I needed shoes because I was learning to be a better person. He smiled and helped me find comfortable sandals, then proper walking shoes, treating this strange American with patience and kindness. "Good choice," he said in English. "Feet need protection. Heart need protection too." I bought flip-flops first, then sandals, then actual shoes. Each step felt like admitting defeat, but also like rejoining humanity. The first time I walked into a temple wearing proper shoes, the monks welcomed me with smiles. Street vendors who had avoided me for years suddenly became friendly again. Children stopped staring in horror. I could sit in restaurants without clearing entire sections. The physical comfort was overwhelming, but the emotional complexity was harder, accepting that I'd wasted years on a completely selfish misunderstanding of spiritual practice. The strangest thing was how differently people responded to me. Conversations that had been impossible before became easy and warm. A taxi driver who'd refused my business for months suddenly greeted me like an old friend. "You look much better," he said in English. More happy. A woman at the market who'd always seemed afraid of me started recommending the best fruits, teaching me Thai names for vegetables. These weren't profound spiritual encounters, they were just normal human interactions that I'd been blocking for years with my stubborn pride. Thai people began treating me like a normal person again, and I realized how much cultural damage I'd done with my stubborn individualism. I'd been so focused on my personal spiritual journey that I'd completely ignored the pain I was causing people who were just trying to maintain community standards of respect and cleanliness. My rejection of shoes had never been about enlightenment. It had been about rejecting anything that required me to consider other people's feelings. I'd confused rebellion with wisdom, isolation with spiritual depth, stubbornness with courage. Through patient conversations with Arpa and other Thai friends, I began to understand that my whole approach had been backwards. Real spiritual growth required humility, not superiority. It meant learning to fit into community life with grace, not insisting that community life adjust to my personal revelations. Respect for local customs wasn't spiritual compromise, it was spiritual maturity. I'd spent 7 years proving how special and enlightened I was, when what I actually needed was to learn how to be an ordinary person who considered other people's feelings. One afternoon, Arpa took me to meet her grandmother, a tiny woman in her 80s who spoke no English but somehow communicated everything through gestures and expressions. She examined my clean feet in proper shoes, nodded approvingly, then served us tea and cookies. Through Arpa's translation, she said, "Tell the American man that wisdom comes from making others comfortable, not making them worry." Then she patted my hand and smiled. I felt more accepted in that moment than I had during all my years of spiritual seeking. The hardest part was apologizing to everyone I'd hurt or alienated during my barefoot years. Some people forgave me easily, understanding that grief and divorce had made me temporarily crazy. "We knew you were suffering," said David, an Australian expat I'd argued with countless times. We just didn't know how to help someone who was so determined to suffer. Others remained distant, and I had to accept that I'd permanently damaged some relationships through my arrogance and self-absorption. The monk at Wat Chedi Luang welcomed me back with gentle wisdom, never making me feel ashamed about my previous behavior. "Suffering makes people do strange things," he said in English when I came to apologize. "What matters is learning, not perfect behavior. You were trying to find truth, but you were looking in wrong direction, inward instead of outward, toward self instead of toward others." He invited me to join their morning meditation sessions, where I learned that real Buddhist practice was about dissolving the ego, not inflating it with spiritual superiority. I started volunteering at local charities, always wearing proper shoes, always trying to show respect for Thai customs and values. At a soup kitchen near the train station, I worked alongside Thai volunteers who taught me their language while we served meals to homeless people and migrant workers. "Service is best teacher," said Aunt Marley, the woman who ran the kitchen. "When you help others, you forget about your own problems. That's real meditation." She was right. Chopping vegetables, washing dishes, serving food, these simple acts felt more spiritually meaningful than all my years of dramatic self-discovery. Real spiritual practice, I learned, wasn't about dramatic gestures or extreme lifestyle choices. It was about small daily acts of consideration, humility, and service. It was about reducing suffering rather than creating philosophical justifications for poor choices. It was about joining community life with grace, rather than insisting that community life revolve around my personal spiritual insights. The monks I'd tried to emulate had never been practicing isolation or superiority. They'd been practicing integration, service, and genuine respect for all beings. One evening, about 2 years after my hospital stay, I was walking home from the soup kitchen when I passed a young Western man sitting alone on a bench, looking lost and angry. His clothes were dirty, his hair uncombed, and he was barefoot. He looked exactly like I had during my worst years. I sat down next to him, not saying anything at first. Finally, he looked at me and said, "You wouldn't understand. Nobody here gets it. They're all trapped in materialism and social conditioning." "I might understand more than you think," I said quietly. We talked for hours. His name was Jake, 28 years old, from Denver. His girlfriend had left him. He'd lost his job, and he'd come to Thailand to find enlightenment. Through rejecting Western values, he'd been living barefoot for 6 months, growing increasingly isolated and angry. I saw myself in his pain, his pride, his desperate need to feel special and chosen. I didn't lecture him or argue about his choices. I just listened, and when he was ready, I told him my story. Jake didn't change overnight, but he started visiting me occasionally. I introduced him to Arpa, to the volunteers at the soup kitchen, to the monk at Wat Chedi Luang. Slowly, he began to understand what I'd learned, that running away from pain doesn't heal it, and that spiritual practice is about connecting with others, not separating yourself from them. When he finally bought his first pair of shoes, he called me crying. "I feel like I'm giving up," he said. "Like I'm admitting defeat." I told him what Arpa had taught me. "You're not giving up. You're growing up." Now, years later, I live quietly in Chiang Mai, wearing shoes like a normal person, speaking decent Thai, and maintaining genuine friendships based on mutual respect rather than fascination with my spiritual extremism. My feet are healthy, my relationships are real, and I've learned that true freedom comes from choosing wisely when to conform and when to rebel, not from rejecting everything out of pride and pain. Arpa and I remain close friends, our relationship built on understanding rather than my need to prove how enlightened I was. I still practice Buddhism, but in a way that honors Thai culture rather than appropriating it for my personal drama. I meditate at the temple with other practitioners. I volunteer at the soup kitchen. I try to live simply and mindfully. But I do all of this while wearing shoes, maintaining proper hygiene, and showing respect for the community that welcomed me despite my years of arrogant behavior. Real spirituality, I've learned, isn't about proving you're different, it's about discovering how connected you are to everyone else. Jake lives in Chiang Mai now too, working as an English teacher, married to a wonderful Thai woman who keeps him grounded and happy. Sometimes we laugh about our enlightened years, but mostly we're grateful for how much we've grown since then. He still asks me sometimes if I miss the feeling of being special, of being the crazy barefoot American who was braver than everyone else. I tell him the truth. What I thought was courage was actually fear, and what I thought was wisdom was actually pride. Being ordinary, being connected, being considerate, that takes real courage. My relationship with Thailand has changed completely. I'm no longer a spiritual tourist extracting wisdom for my personal journey. I'm a resident, a community member, someone who tries to contribute rather than just consume. I pay my taxes. I follow local customs. I help my neighbors when they need it. I've learned to speak Thai well enough to have real conversations, not just order food or ask for directions. I understand now that respecting a culture means more than reading its religious texts. It means living according to its values of community, respect, and consideration for others. Looking back, those 7 barefoot years taught me more about pride than any spiritual text ever could. They showed me the difference between authentic growth and performative rebellion, between real wisdom and elaborate self-deception. Sometimes the thing you think makes you special is actually the thing that keeps you trapped. Sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is admit you were wrong, put on your shoes, and rejoin the world with humility and respect. The irony isn't lost on me. I came to Thailand running away from failure, convinced that geography and extreme spiritual practices could fix what was broken inside me. I thought walking barefoot would connect me to some ancient wisdom, make me more enlightened than the materialistic people around me. Instead, it taught me that wisdom has nothing to do with how different you can make yourself and everything to do with how well you can love and serve others. My divorce wasn't healed by rejecting shoes. My relationship with my children wasn't improved by spiritual superiority. My sense of worth wasn't restored by making other people uncomfortable. What actually healed me was learning to be considerate, to show up for my community, to put others' needs alongside my own. The Buddhism I thought I was practicing was just elaborate selfishness dressed up in spiritual language. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd approached Thailand differently from the beginning. What if I'd come with humility instead of arrogance? What if I'd asked questions instead of making assumptions? What if I'd tried to learn from Thai culture instead of imposing my broken American spirituality onto it? I might have saved myself years of suffering and spared many kind people the discomfort of dealing with my stubborn pride. But maybe that's not how healing works. Maybe some of us need to fall completely apart before we can learn to put ourselves back together in a healthier way. Maybe my 7 years of being the crazy barefoot American were necessary for me to understand what genuine spiritual practice actually looks like. It's messy and humbling and requires you to care more about others' comfort than your own spiritual image. I still live simply, but not as a performance or a statement. I live simply because it allows me to be more generous with others, to volunteer more time at the soup kitchen, to be present for friends who need support. I still meditate, but not to achieve some special state of consciousness. I meditate to cultivate patience and compassion, to become the kind of person who makes life easier for others rather than harder. Real enlightenment, I finally learned, isn't about proving how different you are. It's about discovering how human you are, how connected you are to everyone else's struggles and joys. It's about wearing shoes when shoes are appropriate, following local customs when customs matter, and remembering that your personal spiritual journey means nothing if it causes suffering to the people around you. The barefoot American is gone. In his place is just a man who's learned that the most radical thing you can do in this world isn't to reject everything, it's to show up with love, respect, and clean feet.